a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, also of La Sierra University, also a longtime archaeologist. Today, as we think about Bible and archaeology, we want to explore the connections, biblical connections with Jerusalem, Old Testament, Part 1. And to help us do this, we've asked two experts on Jerusalem, Dr. Bailey Gillespie and Dr. Kent Bramlett, both also of La Sierra University and both very well acquainted with Jerusalem. So, welcome to all of you here. We think about Jerusalem, you say the name Jerusalem, it conjures up pilgrimages, it conjures up history, Old Testament, New Testament. But let's start at the beginning. What do we know about Jerusalem? Maybe what the name means, and then we want to move into something historical about the earliest appearances that we have archaeologically and in the biblical text as well.
I think when somebody says the name Jerusalem, you always think about peace. And that's a relatively modern addition to the name of Jerusalem. If you read the old Jewish literature about Jerusalem, they say that there are 70 different names. Maybe 72 even. So it's had a rich history in terms of its name.
Now, what about if we could go back? Let's take a look at the earliest biblical reference to Jerusalem, and then let's think about the history. Let's think about the connections, and let's go back. Maybe even prehistory. Let's think about how early we know anything about Jerusalem. But let's first of all look at this text, and maybe one of you could read this.
Genesis 14, 17 to 20. The king of Sodom went to meet Abram in the valley of Shevev, the valley of the king. There King Melchizedek of Salem brought bread and drink to Abram and blessed him. So we have a slight reference here to the very beginnings, perhaps, of Jerusalem.
And most people connect the Salem to Jerusalem.
It's one of the other names.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people assume that it's related to shalom, peace, which we suspect is not its original meaning.
Right.
Relates something to the Canaanite god Shalem.
We like it though, and it sells lots of T-shirts. I mean, when you've got Jerusalem and all of the languages, and you think about peace and city of peace and so on. Now, okay, let's look then at historical.
Yeah, well, of course, we have Abraham officially having been at the site there for when he takes his son there.
Yeah, okay, and
Isaac. That's early Old Testament too, so we're very early.
And that's identifying Moriah with Jerusalem. Most people do. I don't know all the lines of debate there.
And so we end up with a rich history of Jerusalem. When you study the city itself, it starts early and goes right on till this week. And if you look at some of the things we've said here, King David, of course, names Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Then the first temple is built there in Jerusalem. And then, of course, the destruction of the temple comes by the Babylonians or the Chaldeans. And then after that, we have a second temple built, time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we have, it lasted some 400 years, actually. And then after that, we have the Roman temple, the Romans building another temple, the second temple. Some would argue that that's the third temple, but nevertheless it's called the second temple.
The fourth.
And then in 312, Christianity expels the Jews from Jerusalem. And then in 638 AD, the Muslims conquer Jerusalem. In 1099, the Christians conquer and then destroy Jerusalem. And then in 1517, the Turks come in, conquer Jerusalem and destroy it too. In 1917, the British are there.
World War I.
And then from 1850 to 1948, we often talk about the return of the Jews back to Jerusalem, and of course the finding of the state of Israel. So it's everybody conquered it, most everybody destroyed it, and we have a history that just is really rich.
Do we know whether earlier Jerusalem was inhabited before Abraham's time?
Well, that's part of the problem. All of these destructions and rebuildings and the fact that it's inhabited as a modern city means that we can't just excavate anywhere. So we know only bits and pieces about Jerusalem's history.
And the tragedy is the reuse. So why would I make my own bricks when I can steal them from 2 centuries earlier at a big brickyard there? So that would be part of the challenge in archaeology, is to really identify where everything happens.
We do have the large city wall and part of the fortifications around the water source from the time of Abraham, the Middle Bronze Age.
So we have some sort of archaeological connection, at least that we can date.
That's right.
We can't connect it with a biblical character.
Yeah, remember that if you're going to
But
build
we
a
can-
city, you have to have water. So
Right.
the water source becomes a crucial issue, and where you actually end up building the city.
And that's going to play a role as we walk through the history, especially the Old Testament part of Jerusalem's history. So we have some tablets. Amarna doesn't sound Hebrew, doesn't sound like it's Israelite or in any way connected. These are from where? These tablets.
These are from Egypt. And Amarna actually comes from the local Arabic name for the site. So this was Akhenaten, the capital city of Akhenaten, the heretic king or the reforming king who moved the capital to this new place.
And we're talking about which century?
14th century, 1300s, about mid 1350 or so. And when the reform didn't last, and when they moved the capital back to Thebes, they left behind at least part of the archive, which they didn't move with them. And people found those in the 1800s. We have approaching, well, it's 380 some, I think, at the current count, approaching 400 tablets. And these are letters of communication with kings or small-time petty kings, rulers of cities or
Right,
city-states,
probably a better way to put it.
including with correspondence with the king of Jerusalem.
And I was going to say, most people connect cuneiform with Mesopotamia. So how do you get cuneiform in
It was
Egypt?
the lingua franca of the time.
So
Egyptians-
the language of what? Commerce
Communication.
and communication
International
across borders
correspondence.
and so on.
Right. And it's good for us because these tablets were preserved in papyrus. Well, in Egypt we get
Some
papyri,
papyrus,
but outside of Egypt not too much. And we have correspondence with the king of Jerusalem at this time. So we
Yes.
know it was inhabited, we know it had a ruler, a king, and under the imperial control of Egypt, his owed loyalty to the pharaoh. But we do know something about the politics of the time because of these
Because of these tablets. And Jerusalem shows up here.
It does.
And not just Jerusalem, but there are several other
Yes.
cities around
Disputes
Palestine, right?
with
Yeah,
neighbors.
yeah, right.
Gezer,
Yeah.
Megiddo are
Yeah,
mentioned.
yeah.
Right. Okay, so we have some artist renditions here growing out, we think, mostly out of archaeology. Talk to us about these.
Well, you've got the first city of David. He had to decide to build somewhere near water, and water source was down in the valley. If you look at this straight on, this picture straight on, you see to the right, you'd have the Kidron Valley, the famous Kidron Valley, and
We have that coming this way.
right there, yes. And so the Mount of Olives would be on the other side of the Kidron to the right. And then it joins kind of like a three fingers at the very bottom of the city there, and it joins the Gehenna Valley, which is the Valley of Hell in the New Testament. And then the little valley in the middle is sometimes called the Central Valley,
the Tyropoeon, yeah,
Valley,
yeah.
or the Valley of the Cheesemakers. It's got all kinds of names. And so the city is on a knoll, and David built close to the water in a logical place where he could build, and he had to build fortifications because he had to be safe, and he had to build a house. So.
Now he rebuilt, did he build or did he rebuild, or should we use that language?
Well, the story, of course, is where he captures the city, Joab does, through the water shafts in some way. What is astonishing, I think, to a lot of people is the size of this city. It's small, about 10 acres,
Yeah,
10, 11
tiny little place.
acres. And most of what we call the modern, or the old city of Jerusalem now, is to the north, up further.
And of course, the temple was built on the high part up there eventually by Solomon.
The people who have been to Jerusalem and seen the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome and so on, so that would be right at the top of the city,
Yes.
right there.
Talking about just inside that
Yeah.
wall, just
Right.
outside that.
So David's city would be south of that on that spur that you've
And
just
you can see
described.
with the geography that if you're going to capture the city, you'd come from the north.
Right,
Because
right.
it's the flattest there. So this is, you build these for strategic reasons, and you build them for impressive reasons, so that you people can look up to them a bit.
Right.
And,
Initially, he probably moved into the Jebusite stronghold, which would be that large building in the middle. We'll come to more discussion of that. But later on, he apparently built his own palace.
Right, right.
And the question, of course, is where. That
So there's both
was.
rebuilding and building going on here.
Right.
And the question is, how much can archaeology help us understand about this?
And the place, even Jerusalem itself, is an interesting political discussion because if you're the king, where do you build it? You've got 12 tribes. Which tribe wins? Which one gets it? And he was moved to where Benjamin was. He built in between the tribes, and it was a pretty safe place. So everyone would look towards the center, and that would be the center.
It's sort of like Washington, D.C., right? Between the North and the South, and between Virginia and Maryland, you carve out a little place that you call the national headquarters.
So a different representation.
Yeah, that's a little more of a geographic view where you can see the hills around it. There are a number of places that are high places, just right, places where they think the palace was. And pretty much you can see those same valleys in this breakdown. And you can see that the city will be growing towards the left, the indication of the wall that was eventually built in even as far as Roman times. So the city grows up the hill and to the left as it grows.
Ah, this looks like archaeology. Those others were artist rendition.
right.
This looks like archaeology. What is it?
Well, the slope there with the stones is often called the stepped stone structure. And this dates to the time of the Jebusites, and it appears to be a retaining wall or an extension to enlarge the Acropolis area, because the kings would want to build on the highest part of the city, and it was kind of narrow right there. So probably initially the Jebusites built this structure, and we know in just a minute we'll see the text that indicates that Solomon rebuilt that for, of course, their palace. Continued
Right. So
royal
a
occupation.
support wall. This is basically a revetment.
And these are excavations in what's called the City of David. This is the name of the excavations.
In fact, we're looking rather southwest,
Yes.
so we're on that eastern side. The valley that we talked about, you described, is on this side.
You have,
I'm sorry.
you have to mentally remove these other buildings which are much later from the Old Testament later period.
Right. So step structure from another angle. Here. Now some archaeology going on, maybe as we speak. I mean, the archaeologist Eilat Mazar has been working for several, decade and a half, 2 decades, the granddaughter of Benjamin Mazar, the famous Jerusalem archaeologist.
Who really excavated the whole area after the Six-Day War in 1967. He got the old Jewish quarter and excavated before they rebuilt it.
And then what they found underneath, they thought they ought to preserve. So you build people's houses up above that. So people were moved up a couple of stories on their property.
That's where the term "everyone who lives in Jerusalem is an archaeologist"
Right.
comes from.
Come see my basement and see what I have.
That's right. So tell us about the excavations going on here.
Well, this is what gets into the news from time to time. Eilat Mazar claimed that she identified certain walls. Not all of these walls, some of these are later, but some of them date to the time of David. And she identified those as being part of David's palace. Because, it's in the right place. It's the high part of the city at David's time. And actually, it's just above that stepped stone structure that would be part of the support.
And then if we look at the drawing, maybe a better isolation of the architecture she was looking at. And
Because of the robbing out to rebuild in later times, we just have fragments, but it indicates a very large kind of building, which would necessarily be an administrative structure. We usually call it palace or something like that.
Now, this kind of discovery often makes the news. Is that good? Is that good news or bad news?
Everyone's looking for biblical connections. And if you're an Israeli, you like to see national reasons for connecting it.
And so how then do we sift through proposals for this kind of structure? How do we define what might actually be more likely than less, especially given the media blitz of discoveries like this one?
We need to be cautious. I mean, it could just as easily be a building that the Jebusites built. David may have occupied it, or it may be part of his reconstruction, but we can't really know.
Well, in the Middle East, archaeology often has a political agenda. You want to establish a residency there for a people. And so anytime anything's found, it makes headline news. You know?
Yeah, it really does. Now, an inscription. So when we think about archaeological contributions to this discussion about Bible and Bible history, inscriptions are really helpful. This one was not found in Jerusalem.
No.
What's its connection?
This is up in Tel Dan in the north. You remember this speech from Dan to Beersheba? It's in the very north, a beautiful spot there, had a temple and beautiful walls and palaces there. And this was found outside, actually, in the very front. And it was a kind of a stone slab, a stela, and is mentioned what seems to be an interpretation which could be defined as the House of David, as part of the country.
Actually,
yeah,
sees
it's right
the lines
there.
down here.
And so this is
David, House of
and
David.
could be then one of the few references outside of Scripture that mention somehow David had a kingdom there.
Right.
You see, it's broken. This is not an Israelite or Judahite inscription. It's Aramean.
Aramean.
Hazael, you put that in the city of Dan after he conquered it.
Yeah.
They apparently broke it, and it was trampled into the pavement of the gateway
Yeah.
at some point after that.
So there's good news with these inscriptions. I mean, to have the dynasty of David mentioned, but the bad news with a lot of these inscriptions, especially the large ones, the monumental ones, is that it's because Israel lost something. And these inscriptions were put up by other people.
Is that not without controversy, the House of David, or what would you say is the prevailing view?
The so-called minimalists
Yeah.
tried to argue that it must refer to something other than David. Maybe, well, there's a variation of the word David, which means uncle or beloved, and they tried to argue that. But the terminology throughout the first millennium BC is widely used, the dynasty of the founder of that dynasty. So I think this is a secure identification.
So we can be pretty confident that it's the biblical David that's referred to in this.
I think so, yeah.
Now, if we showed another inscription from the other side of the Jordan River, the Mesha stela,
Yes.
the large one that was broken in pieces, that too has across the break line what could be David, or
That's right.
maybe even House of David, and both dating to within a couple of decades of each other. So there was some awareness of a dynasty that had its roots in a person by the name of David, and this makes a lot of sense to connect it. So it's a good biblical connection. But even with the Moabite stone, good news to see the name there, bad news because they lost. I mean, that's how these things happen.
But the nice thing about that inscription that you've just referred to is that we have not only Mesha's view of it, but we have the Bible's view of
That's
it in 2 Kings. And so by putting them together, we get a complete picture of what was going on.
At least we get the different reads, because
Right.
you can't weave everything.
No.
And actually, the biblical one is really strange the way it ends,
Right.
because the Moabites offer the eldest son of the king on the wall, and the Israelites outside, they head home.
Right.
And
Can't take that.
yeah, so that's a...
But that's another story.
That's a different story. That's another one. So, another inscription.
Well, they've recently been excavating nearby Jerusalem, and they found a catch of 6 craters, they call them. They're a little small, I think, for that, but with Canaanite language, which probably shows that there were something else going on at the time of David and Solomon. Other people had headquarters. This was for bulk storage, so they may have had a larger establishment. This is found about 3 kilometers away from Jerusalem, so it's in the same area, which shows you that there may have been lots of people living with various tribal groups around the time David
Probably a
started.
lot more complex than the sort of straightforward, okay, these are the people who lived here, nobody else did. Probably a lot more complex.
Well, I think we think of Jerusalem as this giant city in the middle of the desert. You know, there was nothing built outside the walls of Jerusalem until the late 1800s. It was just a city with walls around it, small, 2.5 miles around. So that was an interesting, we have this vision that if it's Jerusalem, it must be golden and huge.
Right.
Yeah.
Canaanite and Hebrew, Kent. What's happening in the development from one to the other?
Well, Hebrew is just a later dialect, essentially, of Canaanite. And of course, Canaanite ceases to be something distinctive sometime in the first millennium.
Right.
Transitions from, well, the language that the kings of Jerusalem spoke in the Armana letters. That's Western Semitic.
I think it might be helpful to keep that principle in mind, that biblical writers, biblical people utilized what was around. Why invent all new things? So they utilized but typically gave a new religious theological twist to whether it's a practice, whether it's a text, and maybe even with the language. We've got that same. And we're certainly going to see it with temple design as well. Another biblical passage.
Well, this is the account in 1 Kings 9 that says, and this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon labored to build the house of Yahweh, his own house, the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So we have a real building campaign going on here.
The underlined words are associated with his work in Jerusalem. And the Milo actually comes from a Hebrew root which seems to indicate a fill. And many people connect with that stone structure, sort of a honeycomb nature that is building up, filling up to create the plateau there.
Now, the Yigal Yadin, who is a famous Israeli archaeologist, suggested that all of those sites, just as the Bible says, were fortified by Solomon, and that 3 of those cities have been excavated. And he argued that maybe even the same architect was responsible for the gates of those 3 cities, and it goes back to Solomonic times. What do you think of that argument?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of discussion on that in the last 15, 20 years.
A diplomatic way of entering the discussion.
I think the latest word would be that we probably can't resolve the issues around the Megiddo gate.
Right.
But probably the Gezer and the Hazor gates do date.
To go back to the 10th century.
But maybe Ahab with Megiddo, that at least has been one of the
very
suggestions.
possible.
So, Solomon's Jerusalem doesn't look
You can
much
see the
different.
city is enlarged, new fortifications, walls, guard posts around the walls show up. A temple complex begins to be formed at the top, where Solomon's palace and temple begins to be built towards the top of that. Right. And so we have a growing city.
We do. And then, when we think about Jerusalem, and especially when we think about Solomon, and we think about the Israelites, we think about Solomon's temple. So, let's talk about this temple. This is, of course, an attempt to describe it. Maybe we should go to another archaeologically defined one, because we don't have anything of.
It's just based on the description in the Bible.
That's right.
That's
right.
We can't excavate where the temple was.
So there are other temples around. Now that may come as a surprise to some people, and especially when we talk about the design of the Ain Dara temple from Syria. What do we have here?
This is one temple. There are 2 which are frequently compared with Solomon's temple. One in Tainat, Turkey, and this one, Ain Dara, in Syria. But from this one, and it dates to the early 9th century, so probably slightly after Solomon's, but there are many parallel features. And this was clearly, in its later stages, an Aramean.
Point a couple of them out.
Sure, this was an Aramean temple, probably Neo-Hittite in its earliest stages. But we have, again, a portico or an entranceway, flanked by 2 pillars. Remember the 2 pillars that Solomon built, freestanding. In the old pictures, we never knew whether they were engaged and holding up part of the entrance or freestanding. From this, it looks like they weren't engaged. We have an antechamber here going into the main hall. This would be the holy place. And then the shrine area, which steps up a little bit, is the most holy place. So we have the same division of sacred space, holy and most holy. And the shrine area is actually flanked with sculptures of Neo-Hittite deities. Would be comparable with, again, the decoration in the temple in Jerusalem, the cherubim representing the majesty of God. And around the outside we have the storerooms, which also, they're a later addition with this temple. But with Solomon's temple, they were part of the original construction. And then they're decorated again with sphinxes and lions. So we have similar decorative motifs as were employed with Solomon's temple.
So I think the question is, if we have similar types of structures, contemporary, some preceding, some after, with Solomon's temple, does Solomon's plan kind of drop out of heaven? Is there some kind of awareness of, I mean, this is a kind of a rhetorical question, there is an awareness of these other temple plans. How do we measure
Let me
those?
complicate it a little more. If you look at Egyptian temples, you have the same figure. You have an outer courtyard, you have a holy place, the most holy place where the ark, the bark, is kept, the boat, and you have it raised up. It's always higher than the holy place. So the Israelites come out of Egypt. They're familiar with these kinds of temples. It's not unusual to see that the whole Middle East is populated with people who had Egyptians had taken part of this country anyway. So there's an influence that's Egyptian as well. And it's hard for people to realize that there must be some relationship to what they knew, and God would perhaps use something that was familiar to them in such a way to make it have more meaning.
I have wondered if, in fact, even at the risk of our misunderstanding, that God tended to use what was familiar to people when they lived. I don't live in that time period. Archaeology is certainly getting us closer. We can understand a lot more about the world of Solomon's temple. And we now know the parallels. And so we have to accommodate.
To meet us where we are.
To meet us where we are.
That's the basic idea behind the incarnation as well.
Right.
And that's the basic idea of temple, so that God's presence is pitched. If you use the earlier tabernacle model, the tent is pitched where people pitch their tents. The temple is built where people build their houses, and it's to be with them. And so we should understand it that way.
As Kent says, that's the incarnational principle, isn't it?
Right.
God comes to meet with us in our form and what we're familiar with.
Now, another item here, we have just a minute left, has to do with some of the decorations. This found in, is it Nineveh? This one found?
I think this one is, or Arslan Tash. Again, this is a Phoenician style. The Assyrians acquired a lot of their art from the Phoenicians as well. But it's a sphinx. We can see the human-headed, lion-bodied, winged creature. And this type of art permeated the ancient Near East.
Now the picture's deceptive because it looks huge, but it's about
Very
that
small.
big around.
It's a furniture inlay.
It's a wonderful.
But it represents better the cherub, or the cherubim. Certainly in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel describes these things with the wings and the body.
The
and
guards.
so on. Right, guards. And guardians for royalty and deity. So you have both of those connected with it. So. Well, I want to thank you, Kent and Bailey and Larry and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. We hope the program has provided some enlightenment for the mind and some food for the soul. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.